Hello, everyone, and welcome to Day 3 of the Logan Center Bluesfest. We're thrilled to have you here for a very special live conversation that is being recorded for the archives for future generations. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Sterling Plumpp and Billy Branch to the stage as part of the Logan Center Bluesfest. Sterling Plumpp, as many of you know, is an American poet, educator, editor, and critic. He has 9 books, 8 of poetry, 1 of prose, 4 chapbooks, 2 edited volumes of poetry, and 1 broadside in his name, along with dozens of publications in academic journals, literary magazines, and other periodicals. His most recent volume, Home Base, from 2013, won the 2014 American Book Award for Poetry. Plumpp employs innovative form, complex wordplay, unique lyricism, and African-American vernacular culture, especially blues and jazz, which are generative forces in his work. Plumpp has mentored countless poets and musicians, including our guest today, Billy Branch and Tyehimba Jess. Billy Branch, 3-time Grammy nominee and Chicago's beloved harmonica player, is faced with the insurmountable request to interview his mentor and friend, Sterling Plumpp. We hope many of you will stay to hear Billy perform after this interview with Sterling and alum and Pulitzer Prize winner Tyehimba Jess on this stage, as well as later tonight during our culminating festival performance with Charlie Musselwhite. Finally, I also want to mention that Billy will be helping us kick off a new program, the Logan Center Second Monday Blues, with our first one starting on November 12th with Jimmy Johnson. That'll be free in the Logan Center Cafe, a performance also followed by an interview. It is very important to us here at the Logan Center as well as to the festival to be archiving conversations with living blues musicians. Finally, I'd like to thank the Reva and David Logan Foundation and the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation for their tremendous support since we started this initiative. We want to thank also the many members of the blues community on campus, off campus, and throughout the city of Chicago who provided advice and support throughout this process. Without further ado, I present you with Sterling Plumpp and Billy Branch.
Good morning. Feels like morning for a blues man who worked till 3 a.m. at Rosa's Lounge. I'm very honored to have this opportunity. And before we get into the actual interview, I want to just give you a little background as to how I know Dr. Sterling Plumpp. I was among, Sterling and I are a little fuzzy on whether I was in the very first group of his students at University of Illinois, but if not, I was one of the first groups. And the way we connected, as I recall, Sterling has a slightly different version of the story, but we had an assignment to relate a short story to the blues. And at that time, I had just entered into the blues field, and I had begun playing harmonica and sitting in various places. But I ran with that question, and so the next class session, he was reading part of my paper to the class and said, "This brother Branch really knows the blues." And I raised up my hand and said, "I play the blues." And he looked at me like I was an alien, and he didn't believe it. But that began an association that lasted almost 50 years. Sterling, in addition to being a friend and mentor, I consider has been a member of my extended family. He's known almost my entire family, from my parents, uncles, my daughter. I think even met my grandparents as well. And I consider him he's been a benefactor. He's helped me in those lean times of those starving artist times. So I am really thankful and grateful to be able to be called his friend, Sterling Plumpp. How about it for him? So some brief bio. Born in Clinton, Mississippi, raised by his maternal grandparents on the cotton plantation, worked as a sharecropper alongside his grandparents, so he didn't attend school until 8 years of age, correct? And could walk 10 miles to school. At 16, he converted to Catholicism. He won a scholarship to St. Benedict's College in Atchison, Kansas, where he discovered Greek literature and James Baldwin's work and was inspired to become a writer. After 2 years in 1962, traveled north to Chicago, worked in a post office, enrolled at Roosevelt University, majoring in psychology while continuing to read widely. He earned a BA in 1968 and an MA in 1971. Sterling's first book of poetry, Portable Soul, was published in 1969. Since then, he's edited and contributed to various anthologies as well as publishing further collections of poetry. He won the Carl Sandburg Literary Award for poetry for the Mojo Hands Call, I Must Go in 1983. Sterling took a post-teaching African American studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago in 1971, which is about the time he and I met. And he went on to become a full professor there, teaching literature and creative writing until he retired with emeritus status in December 2001. Just some of the awards, because I could probably do this whole interview listing his many awards. The most recent is the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. He has been awarded the Fuller Award for Lifetime Achievement. And in 1976, the first Broadside Press Publishers Award and Silver Circle Award for Excellence in Teaching. 83, Carl Sandburg Award. 2000, inducted into the International Literary Hall of Fame for Writers of African Descent by Chicago State University. 2001, wins $1 million in the Illinois lottery. 2002, retires. What as Professor Emeritus of English and African American Studies. Coincidence? 2014, he receives the American Book Award for Home Base, about legendary bluesman Willie Kent. He wins the Illinois Arts Council Agency Literary Award for Mississippi Suite, published in Tri-Quarterly. 2015, received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Selected bibliography, Portable Soul, Muslim Men, Black Rituals, Steps to Break the Circle. I'm just highlighting now because this is a long list as well. Harriet Tubman, Blues, The Story Always Untold, Paul Robeson, Velvet Bebop, Kente Cloth. Okay, so Sterling, let me just begin and about your early years. What would you say some of your earliest memories?
The earliest memory I have is of my grandmother telling me that she was not my mother, that her daughter was my mother. My mother had had a son under her maiden name the day after she became 17, and some 3 years later, I was a second son under her maiden name. My mother, after about 3 months, went away and married someone, and so I have absolutely no memory of bonding with her. And so she told me that her daughter was my mother, and I kept telling her, no, you are my mother and she is your daughter.
Wow. Wow. So what were some of the challenges and struggles? I mean, that had to be a very challenging situation for a young boy.
Well, the biggest challenge when you are a child and literally your parent are 50 and 60 when you were born, there's something intuitively in you to say that they will not be there when I grow up. And so I always fear that one of them would die and my world would fall apart.
Wow. And your father, did you have a relationship with your father at all?
My father was married, had 3 children, and had a sexual encounter with my mother when she was 17, literally lived next door. But in this agricultural community, my grandfather took the position that since my father was not going to marry my mother, there was no need for him to have any relationship with the child. However, his mother and my brothers adopted me before I can remember.
So how were you able to, or what gave you strength and guidance through those youthful, challenging years?
Since my parents were what they called Christians in those days, they were grandfather, deacon in the church. My grandmother was a mother of the church, and they were the type of family where every morning when they got up, my grandfather would pray for about 15 minutes out loud. My grandmother would follow suit, and then at night, when they retired for bed, my grandfather would repeat that and pray again for about 15 minutes, and my grandmother would follow suit. Then if there was some contingency plan, such as a tornado approaching, they would fall on bended knee and pray. So I, as a young person, grew up with the idea that there was no problem too big for God to handle. Very much a believer.
But your grandparents, it said at 16 you converted to Catholicism. They weren't Catholic, I'm presuming, right?
My grandparents were Baptists. What happened when my grandfather died, I was 14 years old. That meant that I left the plantation, moved to Jackson, Mississippi, where fortunately I had an aunt who was a bootlegger. And the decision was made to put me into the premier prep school for African American. It was a Catholic school. So I was 7th and 8th grade in the Catholic school and eventually in high school. And what the Catholics are very good at is letting you know that you're a good student, but you would be more welcome if you were Catholic.
You know, I always, until I really did research, I always, even though I knew you're from the South, I always had this illusion, because you'd always refer that you went to the private school and, of course, very highly educated, that you came from this almost like upper middle class strata of Southern culture, but that was not the case.
That was not the case. Now, the question of Catholics in Mississippi, the upper class blacks went to Catholic school. In fact, 2 of my classmates became Supreme Court justices of the state of Mississippi. The leading civil rights lawyer daughter was in school. Sons and daughters of undertaker owners, doctors was there, professors. So I came up poor peasant in the company of people who were destined to go to the university.
And you began, I read that you didn't begin your schooling until a fairly late age, correct?
Yes, sir, I thought that my grandmother, who was born in 1890, did not know anything about Piaget, Erik Erikson, and she didn't have an interest of me getting preschool, kindergarten, and years later, my aunt, her daughter, told me that my grandmother's position was that the only thing in this world that she had any care for was one of her children. And if anything happened to them, she did not want to know what to do. And since it was about a 5-mile round trip walk to school, she wanted us to be big enough to take care of ourselves as we made that endeavor.
In an interview, you said that the first 15 years of your life were dictated by the fear. I think you stated that the loving and caring grandparents would die. You'd have to embark on the adventure of living with your mother and stepfather. But how did you satisfy your thirst for knowledge and desire for achievement as a young boy and teenager?
Two things. One of them is physical. The other one is that I was in the 7th grade at age 15, so I'm a misfit. The other aspect of me, I grew up as a youth who was very skinny. In fact, I think I weighed, at 6'2" and a half, I weighed about 135 or 100 pounds when I graduated from high school. And so I took refuge in books. You know, my idea was that if you're smarter than someone, it would be very difficult for them to make fun of you.
You also said in an interview you were told to carry the name of your real father, although he had nothing to do or nothing to say about your life.
Yes, my grandfather was patriarchal, and I need to say something about my real father's name was Cyrus H. Plumpp. And there's 2 P's on the name. And it does not take a genius to realize that only one of the P's mean anything. You know, I have been subsequently told that my father's father was lynched, that he could not accept the codes imposed on blacks in Mississippi. And one Sunday morning, he killed 2 white people, came home, told his wife to take my father, go to the woods, only travel at night. And since the wife and the child was his primary focus, he stayed in the house. They came, apprehended him, and they hanged him by the neck until he was dead.
This was
my father's father.
Your father's father.
Yeah. And that he was so ornery, and he did a lot of things that was unsavory, and so how he changed his name was to add another P to it. There are relatives of mine, when I became a writer, you know, and they looked up things, they said, oh, he must be a relative. In South Bend, Indiana, told me that we were relatives, and their name is spelled with 1 P, and that my father's father had added another P in order to change his identity.
So how did you face the challenges of not living with your mother and father, and when were you reunited with your mother?
For a short period of time, at about the age of maybe 16 or 17, I lived with my mother and stepfather. My stepfather attempted to rape my sister, and my mother came after him with a butcher knife, told him that if he come back, he was dead.
Shoot.
And I lived with my mother, and unbeknownst to me, my mother was not able to cope. She couldn't handle money, and I lived with her, and maybe we moved 5 times in 1 year. And I was not thinking about that. And one cold day in November, my sister was sick, and I left her home in the bed, went to school, and after school I returned home, and to my shock I found our possessions set out on the street. My aunt, who had means, had taken my sister, picked her up, and in the last two years of high school, I lived with my aunt. You know, I live with my aunt, but the problem that you have, if you're living with someone else, you don't feel like you're a family, because I never asked them for anything, money to go to the prom, anything, other than tuition to go to school. I never asked them for anything else.
So, what happened with your mother? Did you all continue?
I did not see my mother again for a whole year. Incidentally, my mother died, fast forward, my mother died of breast cancer. Did not say anything when the doctor told her that she had the spot. And she almost literally scratched the breast away. And it was in so much pain she could not sleep. And at the time that I went out to represent the family and asked the doctor, how can you treat her? And he said, you cannot treat cancer unless you remove it. My mother had wanted to die. She told me that she thought that if they cut on her, she was going to die, and she would rather die with her whole body. And at the same time she told me that, she apologized to me for not being there when I was a child and for her inability to cope.
So, but you did maintain a close relationship with her up until when she passed?
Yes, my grandmother, I probably would not have another anecdote. My mother had breast cancer, was spread to her lung. The cancer took away the right lung, and I get a call from my mother saying, I need to see you, and I need to see you right away. I go from Jackson, Chicago to Mississippi, and my mother gives me a laundry list of things that she wanted to happen at her funeral, saying metaphorically that she had made her peace with God. And my grandmother was the one that said, you have to be there and listen to what she say. And I asked my grandmother, I said, well, why would my mother call me and ask me to take care of her funeral when she lived with my daughter? And my grandmother told me, said, boy, you crazy. Said, don't you know that your mother thinks that because you have gone to school with these white folks, you are crazy enough to do anything she say?
So ultimately, you all did reconcile and enjoyed a good relationship?
Well, death is a very, how do I want to put it? Passing is a difficult ritual. Yes, we reconcile, and I apologize to her for having the doctor operate on her because I knew she wanted to die. And that way we was on good terms, and I made sure that the request that she made about her funeral, she didn't want the coffin open. She did not want the minister to talk more than 5 minutes. She did not want to be buried from the church. She said, you might as well take me straight from where they embalmed me to the cemetery. And that's exactly what I told the minister. You know, say 1 or 2 words. And she gave me a picture. So if people want to see me, say you make copies of this picture and you show it to them. And basically that was about it. My mother was one of the type of women who was very physical. I mean physical. You know, if you were a male, you would have to hit her more than with your hand to get her down. She would come after you with bad intentions.
In your young adult years, what propelled and motivated you in your, coming of age, about to enter or after you entered university?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 things that I don't want to. It seemed to me that subconsciously I had this irreconcilable fear of death. I did not like the way corpse looked, and did not want to be one day a corpse. And so I was very religious. So religious that at one point I applied to the seminary to become a priest. And they raised all kinds of questions about the nature of my birth, the fact that I had been born illegitimate, and I did not become a priest. And fortunately for me, I studied Greek literature, and maybe Prometheus, Unbound, Oedipus Rex. I couldn't believe that the Greek gods were gods. They did too much. They did all these evil things. One of them had an eagle to come down and rip open Prometheus' chest every night and eat his liver. I mean, so, I got to thinking, that's what kind of God is that? Then I read the Divine Comedy, which completely changed my concept. And what he did, if you read it, the Inferno, there were people like kings and popes he put in hell. And I said, hell, what kind of occupation is that? I don't know what it is, but it's the kind of occupation that I want.
One of your quotes, you said, at the time, I did not know whether I wanted to be a black writer or a white one, only that I wanted a vision fashioned from my experience and preserved by my skill. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. See, literature is it's a very complex thing. Let me try to simplify it. Maybe thousands of years, going to the Hebrew, what we call the Bible was transmitted orally, right? And people would but once you print it, it becomes a text. Whether it's Greek folklore, once you write down Homer, it becomes a text. And once you get people like Milton, Dante, it becomes text. So that this idea of what am I going to do? If I say, well then, I think I'm going to become a novelist, right? Well then how do I overlook people like Mark Twain? Faulkner. That's where I'm coming from. How can I overlook it? It's almost like, I'm going to become a harmonica player and I'm going to overlook Little Walter. I don't care whether you're black or white. There are certain things that are canonic that you have to pay deference to. The other thing that's on my mind, African Americans have never been completely accepted as human beings in this country. Even the last president, it's absolutely unforgivable. He's not a citizen. He's not a citizen, and they got birth certificates. Right. And the whole thing about Voting Rights Act. Why should we have a Voting Rights Act? Well, I was born here. Prior to 1828, all white males couldn't vote. Prior to 1919, white women couldn't vote. Everybody is added to the Constitution. It's a good thing, but all of a sudden you say you'll get some kind of guarantee for African Americans to vote. You face that, and when you are intelligent enough to know that people are speaking distruths about you, well, it makes you angry. So my hung up of knowledge led me to the position where I wanted to develop the literacy capable of discounting these things that are being said negatively about me.
Your interests and talents are very diverse, and music, history, political science, sociology, psychology, and more. What anchored your intense curiosity and guided your career choices?
Maybe the man that had the greatest impact on me in an odd way, and it's a man that in many ways I disrespect and disagree with, was Booker T. Washington. Coming out of the South, reading up on slavery, and I was in profound shock to realize that he was an adult going to night school, working in the mines and going to school during the day, becoming literate at that late age. That's number one. Number two, I had read Richard Wright in Black Boy, and he talked about how he had to lie to white librarians to get the books that would help inform him as a writer. And he wound up by saying that as he became a writer, maybe he learned to make meaning out of meaningless suffering.
In one of your interviews, you said, I always wanted to be a blues singer. And long as I've known you, I don't know if you've ever told me that. And why was that, and what made you change course and become a writer?
Two things about the blues singer and the jazz musicians. See, when you're educated in black, they make you an honorary white for a few seconds of every day. And so you develop this kind of attitude that you have to please, and the thing that struck me when I saw Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf is how arrogant they were from the stage. They had these big men, drunk, and the women are flocking to them. That would be a good profession. The problem with that, I cannot sing. The problem with that, I cannot sing. And when I bought the harmonica, my aunt said, "No, you're educated." Now, I was so hungry for learning how to write because writing courses in the university, some universities discourage it. You don't learn how to write. You get some people sitting around telling you that this poem is a good poem, or that poem. See, it's only when you look at a work of art and try to imagine how the author conceived it, number one, and then you look at his techniques and where did he get the techniques? You know, and you go through 10 years sometime trying to become a writer and you can't put anything down on the page. Now, those people who get discouraged by their inability to put things on the page don't become writers. Because you go through, I mean, you can't write every day. I mean, the great literature, a lot of them is about death. You know, Milton was blind. You know, Walt Whitman was in the Civil War. I mean, you can't make that up. That's why a lot of the literature that's being written today is not worth reading. You know, people haven't been in Vietnam. You know, they haven't been in prison, you know. They don't have AIDS. You hear what I'm saying? Policemen are not shooting them in their head for nothing. See, I mean, all of this stuff about what my mother did, and nobody interested in that nonsense, you know what I mean? So I don't think great literature is being written. You know, I don't think a great little, you know, the United States, I love the country, right? You know, I don't know nothing about Hitler, but in terms of military power, this country has that ability to impose its will on the world. You know, there's nothing good about that. There's nothing good about that. But then, you know, you come up and you've been indoctrinated, you know, and you're happy that you topple a racket or something like that. You know, and nobody, that's not what you're writing about, because that's not going to get you a Pulitzer or anything else.
You also said that music made me discover I was Southern. I watched the blues in person at least 5 hours a week. That was in 1982, and I remember those were the days we were hanging out together a lot, going to. Well, you can tell the story better than I can.
It's a funny thing. You think you know the blues, but it was only two things happened when I met Billy and he became a professional. Number one, he made sure that the club owners would allow me to come into clubs and they wouldn't charge me anything. Number two, and this is very important, he made sure that they would only charge me $1 per drink. No. See, in that way, I was exposed to all these musicians. And number three, and I didn't realize it, these blues singers singing in these deep vernacular, not expressing their words, he slowed that down so I could actually hear them, you know. You know, they don't repeat all that, they slowed that down, and that allowed me to fully appreciate it. And since I saw Billy before he was a professional musician, and then I see him after he played with Willie Dixon, I didn't know it was the same person. That much of a change, and it's not simply dexterity. It's something about the tone. You know, this is someone that's belonged on stage with Howell and Wolf, with Muddy Waters. There's something about the tone of the harmonica that you get from playing every night and playing with masters.
They say we got time for one more question, and I had so many. How do you view the role of the blues in African American life?
difficult question, but I spent 3 semesters in the Mississippi Delta, and maybe I read 5,000 pages. Whatever is said about African American life, there's an instinct to try to say that that's not true. And one of the things about blues, it opens the door to the dark places of black experience so that air comes in and they celebrate that. You know, very few people, you know, say, what did Elmo James say? Say, a 12-year-old boy took my baby away from me. If that happened, you wouldn't say it. You'd see the blues singer come right down. I'm thinking of Sonny Boy Williamson. It's not so much about sex, and people can say all the things. I can remember that line where he said, "You've been talking about your woman." He said, "I wish to God that you could see mine." So you've been talking about your woman. Say, "I wish to God you could see mine." So every time the little girl starts loving, she bring eyesight to the blind. See, you don't get that kind of honesty. You know, see everybody else, you know. My wife, the blues singer bring it right down front emotionally, and I think that that is healthy. The other problem is with this kind of ability of society to make you a carbon copy of something, I think culture is what keeps people alive. And between the blues and the culture of the black church, I think that that's why authentic black culture is.
All right. Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank Sterling Plumpp again for allowing me to be his friend, for being a mentor, and for teaching me so much over the years. I do remember that after his classes, typically a group of students, you'd always find a crowd of students at his office, so much so you couldn't even see him for the students standing around. And he was one of the most popular and most influential instructors at the University of Illinois. So once again, I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sterling Plumpp.
Another round of applause for Sterling and Billy Branch.
I got to see you. I just got to see you somehow. But not tomorrow.